Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Hey guys, Jared here. Welcome to another episode of All Things Crime. Man, I'm excited to come to you today from the Provo River, which is in the Heber Midway area of Utah. It's on the backside of the Wasatch Mountains, and this is one of the most pristine rivers in the entire world, actually. And apologize for the hat and sunglasses, but it's a nice warm day today, and if I didn't have this on, I'd be burning my noggin. So, hey, while I'm here, I want to encourage you to subscribe and share this with your friends. And if you're listening to this, definitely go to our YouTube channel so that you can see these amazing sights. I'll kind of pan around this. There's lots of fishermen around, so hopefully won't be disturbing them too much. But the interesting thing about this river right here, and particularly where I'm at. So in 1996, in a December morning, actually night, Crystal Beslanowicz, who was a 17-year-old wayward teen, actually died about 20 meters from where I'm at right now. I'm going to pan around here really quick. So Crystal was originally from Spokane, Washington area, and she found herself down here in the Salt Lake area, and which is probably 45 miles from where I'm at. And if you look, actually I'm panning them around right over there, right over here, and I'm gonna actually go over to where those rocks are here in just a second. But that's where she died. And this river's changed a little bit. There's some different rocks. They actually, I want to say in the late 90s, they kind of did a reclamation of this river and kind of redirected some of the things. There used to be a service road just to the kind of the south side, to my left that you can't really see, but I'll show you the little trail that's there now. It's used by especially the fishermen and people that want to take pictures and stuff. But that used to be a service road, and it was just a small 2-lane, something you could probably get a truck on if you really needed to, but more size of a ATV maybe. And that on the very where the road actually connects to where the river goes under the road, there's a bridge there now, and there used to be a small parking lot. Now, the guy that actually killed Crystal Beslanowicz killed her with a couple of river rocks. And again, it's just not 20 meters from where I'm standing right now. And it's absolutely incredible to think that in this serene, beautiful, amazing scene that I'm looking at right now, that in 1996, on a early or late the night of the 16th, I think, is somewhere around there, but they didn't find her till the next morning, where she was deceased by the riverbank, and she had been bludgeoned to death with some granite river rocks. And if you've never seen granite, it's very sharp, very jagged, and there were 2 rocks in particular that were about, I don't know, maybe 10 pounds each, but big enough that a man with his hand could grip it and cause a lot of damage, but not so heavy that it'd take 2. And then there were a number of other rocks that had, a lot of blood and stuff like that on them. But the tragic thing is, Crystal, as a 16-year-old, if you ever see her picture, and again, go to the YouTube channel. Hope you guys subscribe and you can see this. I'm gonna show you her 16-year-old picture when I believe she was a sophomore in high school. She looks like the typical high schooler, innocent, all-American type girl. And but by the time she was 17, she was hooked on drugs, doing prostitution, doing a lot of sketchy things, which is really sad. And she had moved with her, 32-year-old boyfriend. Yeah, what a winner this guy must have been to be hooked up with a 16-year-old. And he brought her down here to Salt Lake, got her hooked on drugs and prostitution, and she went downhill really, really quick. And it's just such a tragic story. But how she ended up here is still kind of a mystery. But they knew her killer, a man named Joseph Simpson, was a driver for a lot of the, he's like a limo driver. So he would pick up a lot of people at the airport, the Salt Lake City airport, and drive them up here into Heber. And Park City is about 12, 15 miles to the north. And a lot of ski resorts there. There's, cross country skiing. There's all sorts of amazing things here. But I'm actually in a little town called Midway, and maybe 5,000 people. Very, very quiet. There's been a lot of development here. There's a ton of money moving in here, from California and everywhere else. But, all the really wealthy people want to have these kind of out of the way resort homes, really. And Park City, the really rich people are kicking out the rich people, and so some of those people have kind of moved down here into Heber, and boy, it's beautiful. So can't say I blame them. But anyway, there's but just to my left over this direction, it used to just all be farmland, and there was a fence. I actually came out here with the old sheriff, Sheriff Bonner, who was the original investigating officer with Crystal's murder. And he worked his way, it took him about 17 years, but he worked his way up to becoming the sheriff. And as the sheriff, he was finally able to solve this case. And he said that was one of the main things that he wanted to accomplish before he retired. And sure enough, he was able to do it. And a big reason was because they finally were able to use the MVAC on those rocks. And they vacuumed Joseph Simpson's DNA off of the rocks, the ones that he had used to bludgeon Crystal to death. And just extremely violent crime. They think what had happened was they probably were partying together, and maybe she was turning tricks with him, but he had brought her up here for some reason and was in that parking lot. And when Crystal was turning tricks, she always wore her socks, and that was typically the only thing that she wore. And so they found her body next to a bunch of those bloody rocks, but also there was a folded pair of socks right next to her, and it was on kind of a flat rock that I'll show you here in a second. But that rock, they think that's where she was sitting when she was taking her socks off, and she had folded them neatly and put her next to her, and that's basically where Joseph Simpson caught up with her. Now, this is a night in December here in Heber on the backside of the Wasatch Front. I can tell you right now, nobody is going to want to be running around here naked. And so she must have been in absolute desperate straits to have run. I'm probably 300 meters from that road. That's a long ways to run when you're only wearing a pair of socks. Now, there was a fence that if anybody's ever been on a farm, you know that when you have a fence and it kind of gets, maybe it's pushed down by cattle or by other, deer or something like that, and then it gets driven over a lot, or it lays there a long time. Eventually, dirt and rocks and stuff will kind of grow over the top of it, and it'll almost be embedded into the dirt, but it's kind of hidden. And at night, there's no way, I would think, even with a full moon, that Crystal could have seen that little fence or the gate that was in the trail or in that little service road. And she must have stepped on it, and it must have cut her foot, because they did find a laceration on one of her heels. And that's probably, if you've ever stepped on like a barbed wire fence, yeah, that hurts. So she probably stepped on that and was forced to stop, and then was sitting on that road, maybe trying to look at her heel, and she probably thought she was safe. She'd run far enough, but back then in 1996, this area here, I'm showing you kind of a selective area of this Provo River because I wanted to kind of be isolated as I was recording this. But I'll tell you, back then, there was nothing here but farmland. So even if she had screamed, I don't think anybody could have heard her. But yeah, you can see on the riverbanks, there's some rocks. They kind of, like I said, did that reclamation project, and they kind of redid the banks, but they brought in a lot of granite rock for that. And that granite, some of those granite rocks is what Joseph Simpson picked up, and he used whatever weapon he had, and he bludgeoned her to death right here on the banks of the Provo River. So that one cold case, it went cold for a long time, 18 years. So a couple of months after the trial was over in 2016, I was able to go out to the site where Crystal was murdered with Sheriff Todd Bonner, and he gave me his perspective. So I think it'd be really interesting for you guys to hear it. So here he is.
On the morning of December 16th, 1995, I was dispatched about 1 minute to 10 in the morning to a location on the Upper Provo River. I have the report of a deceased person found along the Provo River. When I got to the area, I met with two individuals, a father and a son, by the name of Mark and Wesley Wilson. They happened to own a farm along the Provo River area. It was a very cold morning. It was about 28 degrees, and they told me that they had driven down on a kind of a icy, the puddles on the road had iced over, gone down to feed their cattle, which they got there about 8:30 in the morning. They happened to feed their cattle. It took them a couple hours. On their way back, they're going through the gate and discovered a young female lying face down on some granite rock area adjacent to the river. They went to their farm, sorry about that, their farm home, which was about a mile from the location of where they happened to find the body, and when they called our dispatch. I happened to be in the Midway area, but I met them right at the entrance to this road. It's a dirt access road, fisherman access road, off of River Road is what it's known by. Once I met with them at the entrance to this road, they took me to the location. That's about where we're standing now, of where this young lady had been murdered. In discovering some of the evidence in the area, like wounds to her body, it had definitely had appeared that she was murdered in this location. She took quite a beating from the looks of things with granite rock, which is a very rough, pointed, jagged type of stone. We found two different rocks that happened to have what appeared to be body matter, as well as blood on these rocks, and some very large stones that had quite a bit of blood on them that appeared to have been used after she had been down, which had been dropped on her skull. Ended up bringing the several different people in from Wasatch County Sheriff's Office. We ended up calling the medical examiner, Rudy Reet, who was the chief medical examiner at the time. Brought him in from Salt Lake, who helped us with the crime scene, as well as the State of Utah Crime Lab. We brought him in as well and made sure that we gathered what we needed to, collect the evidence and whatnot. We didn't want to destroy anything, and so once everyone got together and we sketched the scene, photographs were taken, evidence was collected. She was taken to the medical examiner's office in Salt Lake to prepare for an autopsy. Once everything was gathered, and it took several hours, we're talking most of the day we spent here. We sent several people. We even called out our search and rescue to walk the riverbanks, making sure we didn't miss anything that way. We did collect, I think it was a total of six stones that we gathered as evidence. We had found a beer bottle, a whiskey bottle, her socks had been taken off and placed on a large stone, kind of a flat stone where her socks were laying. We had one officer checking the highways who gathered and collected shirt, jacket that had been found, a box of condoms, some shoes, several different items. Not everything was identified as crystals, but those that had been identified had been sent to the Utah State Crime Lab. In 2000 and, well, to begin with, we had worked this case for a couple of years with not coming up with a whole lot of good leads. I mean, we had several leads, but that took us from Washington State to South Dakota, but nothing really panned out that great. So it wasn't until 2009 when then Detective Wayne Winterton had heard about some new evidence techniques to be checked with Sorensen Forensic. Once the stones were taken to Sorensen Forensic, and the science and everything that was gathered and collected there, we realized we had some information that we knew then that was a solvable case. From there, other people got involved, such as Todd Park with Salt Lake Cold Case Homicide Division. One thing led to another, and we was directed to a company by the name of MVAC. We ended up speaking with our attorneys, and we had to do a disclosure saying that it was okay to use the rest of the evidence that we had on the different parts of, or the different rocks for evidence, and that we were going to use it, and it would kind of a one-shot deal, at least how I took it. Just kind of a one-shot to see what we could come up with. And I think that was the year of 2013 when the MVAC system got the evidence that we needed to pursue the case even further, where it showed our suspect as being a white male. Led us to Joseph Simpson, who was actually living in Florida at the time, who had been in prison once before for murder, but because of the technology, it was able to trace him back to the time that he had spent. His DNA that was gathered at the Utah State Prison at the time, a match was gathered. Okay, this is the entrance to the crime scene of Crystal Beslanowicz in 1995. If you can tell, the river is running at that time of year. It's a little bit lower than what it is right now, but there was a roadway that went right along the river. It has just turned into a walking trail now, but at the time, the fisherman access was a nice dirt, gravel in some areas, road that just followed the river all the way down to the Wilson property.
Okay, so I'm kind of making my way downstream a little bit from where I just was, and I remember right after the trial, I came out here with Sheriff Bonner, and he was kind of showing me around, and these trails weren't quite as pronounced as they are now, but he brought me right here. He kind of recognized it, and even from 18, 19, 20 years earlier, you know, that's just something that just gets absolutely embedded in your mind. And he brought me out here, and he was showing me this, and so we were coming through this thicket of trees right here, and I remember we got about to right here, and he just kind of froze, and he was like, "That's the rock." He said, "That rock right there is where Crystal was Crystal's socks. That must have been where she was sitting, and that particular rock is where he found the socks, and then her body was just a little ways off." And you know, the real tragedy, well, I mean, there's so many tragedies with this case, but one of the tragedies was a farmer and his young son, I think he was 15 or 16 years old, are actually the ones that found Crystal's body the next morning. And when they found her, you know, clearly she was deceased, but they were just out like every other morning, out feeding the cows, and lo and behold, you know, they kind of look over and they're like, man, that looks weird. So they go over there and they find a young girl's body, and I can't imagine how traumatic that must have been. You know, I don't care how old you are or how much experience you have. Finding a young girl's bludgeoned, bloody body that's naked next to this pristine Provo River had to have been just an absolute shock to the system. And so, like I said, Sheriff Bonner at the time was just a deputy. He'd done some narcotics work. He said he'd been with force about 3 years is all. And yeah, but when he was coming through this thicket of trees right behind me, that's when he basically just kind of froze, and he said, "That's the rock." I remember that scene just vividly, and this is it. You know, it's just such again, it's just such a gorgeous, amazing place, and I'm kind of panning around right now. You can see trees everywhere. You see the mountains in the background. You can see the river now, and what a gorgeous, amazing place. If you've never been here, you guys, you just have to come visit, because the Provo River and the Wasatch Front, you know, the mountains of Utah are just absolutely gorgeous, and it's hiking trails everywhere. There's world-class fishing, and go river rafting, where there's so many just absolutely fun things to do here. So, yep, but this is it. Right behind me is right where those rocks were. So before we wrap up, I thought it would be awesome to hear from the assistant district attorney that actually helped prosecute Joseph Simpson, and his name's McKay King. He's a great guy, and I also, when I was out there with Sheriff Bonner, I also stopped by his office and got him to kind of, you know, describe what it was like to prosecute that murder.
My name is McKay King. I'm a Deputy Wasatch County Attorney.
And why did you get into doing what you're doing?
Being an attorney?
Yeah.
Just kept going to school, and eventually only had a few choices left, and so here I am.
Let's see, that's not quite the answer. But,
Why am I a prosecutor versus, you know, I worked in law for 3 years prior to becoming a prosecutor, and I felt like getting justice, getting the right thing done is more difficult in other fields than whereas the prosecutor, you get to decide when you first screen a case, is this a case that needs to be prosecuted? Is this a case where justice will be met? And that has, you know, since been my entire goal in my profession is to be able to accomplish justice. In 1995, Dan Matthews was the county attorney, and Derek Pullen, who is now a judge, were deputies, and they originally went to the scene, were involved in the initial investigation, but there was nowhere to go. Law enforcement didn't have any good leads. The county attorney's office couldn't do anything to help with it, and there have been a couple of county attorneys since then, and our current county attorney first became involved in the state crime lab was asking about testing certain pieces of evidence and whether or not they needed to be fully consumed as part of that process. I believe Sorensen also had a cigarette butt. In order to do all the testing, they needed to be able to consume that entire sample, and so our office became involved at that point in determining whether or not that would affect a case for prosecution later. And letters were written saying, yeah, you know, do the testing that needs to be done, and we'll just deal with it later when the case comes to trial. Then the first real break came when we were notified in January of 2013 that there was a CODIS hit, and from that point until the trial was over, we were meeting with the law enforcement team monthly or more on this case, dealing with different aspects of the evidence in the investigation. That first hit came in, it said that there was a match between DNA found on the victim and someone that had been in prison for murder. And because of her occupation, that didn't really lead to prosecutable evidence. That wasn't anything that we could take to a jury, but it was a lead. And so we started talking to other investigators, other prosecutors, trying to get ideas on what we can do now. And it was in one of those discussions, either with Todd Park or Vince Meister, who both work for Salt Lake, Todd as an investigator and Vince as a prosecutor, that I believe we were pointed in the direction to go back to Sorensen Forensics, because they had some new testing techniques, which is how we became aware of the MVAC, and that we could use that on items taken from the scene to try to connect the DNA evidence to the actual crime rather than just to the victim. Because they had already taken DNA samples from rocks that had been found at the scene and used in the crime, and the profiles they'd gotten back had been inconclusive and not comparable, because the amount of DNA and the ability to separate that out wasn't possible. Then the rocks were tested using the MVAC, and they were able to get an amount of DNA that they could ferret those profiles out and give us a clear profile rather than just some DNA information. A lot of what went on at trial in this case was talking about the difference between a real profile, a comparable profile, and just DNA. Because on almost any item, if you test it, you're going to get some DNA. And the defense spent a lot of time talking about, well, there was DNA on that rock and it doesn't match the defendant. And the answer was, well, there's not a profile. That's not DNA that is helpful to anybody. It's just DNA that was found on the rock. But because of the MVAC, we were able to get profiles off of the murder weapon. And that really is what allowed us to prosecute this case.
Hey, I just wanted to wrap this up really quick. Just want to say thanks to all those that contributed to it, both Sheriff Bonner, Clips, and some of the prosecuting attorneys. These guys are absolutely amazing in the job that they did prosecuting Joseph Simpson. And the amazing thing to me is, and this is pretty consistent with all law enforcement, is they just never give up. Sheriff Bonner, through his entire career, this case bothered him more than just about any other case, and he never gave up. They reopened it whenever they found new technologies, and they tried swabbing. They tried doing all sorts of things to get Simpson's DNA off that rock, because they knew that to grip it that hard and to cause that much damage on crystal, they would have the suspect would have had to have gripped that rock really tight, and so that would have deposited a lot of DNA. And they couldn't get fingerprints because granite is just so rough that you'd never get a good fingerprint. But the DNA would be in those little cracks and crevices of the rock, and sure enough, it was. And all they needed was the right tool. And whenever we give our law enforcement the right tools, they can solve cases. I mean, sometimes there's just no evidence. There's just absolutely nothing that they can do. But if there's evidence there, they'll find a way to get it. And it doesn't matter how long it takes. Doesn't matter what they have to do. They fly all over the country. They'll go interview suspects. They'll go talk to family members. They'll do, just amazing things. And, our law enforcement need the kudos that they deserve, because there's a concerted effort to try to get rid of these guys, because number one, they are our first line of defense. And number two, they are basically, a lot of the tough men and women who are willing to stand up, not just for our freedoms, but also for the rule of law, justice, and the most important justice that can ever be brought are to the victims. And if society realizes that they'll never get justice no matter what happens, then society will fall apart. And there are forces out there that are actually trying to do that, and we have to fight against them.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.